settle in, let the quiet embrace you. Tonight we drift back to an awful time, exploring why it truly sucked to be a soldier in World War I. Imagine constant damp, gnawing fear and the sheer misery of trench life, a daily fight against unimaginable horrors. We'll delve into these grim details with a calm look at this harsh reality. If this detailed, soothing, boring history helps you unwind, please like and subscribe for more. We'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let our journey into the past begin as we explore the grim. As we settle deeper into our understanding, let us cast our minds back to the summer and autumn of 1914. Across Europe, the air, once filled with the hum of ordinary life, began to thrum with a different, more urgent energy. Drums beat and voices rose, calling young men to the colors, to king and country, to abstract ideals of national honor. For many, a wave of patriotic fervor was irresistible. A chance for adventure, an escape from mundane routines, a righteous cause. For others, perhaps a quieter, more stoic resolve took hold, a grim acceptance of duty, a path they felt compelled to walk, not with joyous shouts but with a heavy, quiet heart. This pull to enlist was amplified by pervasive propaganda. Bright posters showed heroic figures valiantly charging. Newspapers promised daring exploits, assuring the public the boys would be home by Christmas. Songs filled music halls with jaunty tunes, painting war as a noble, exciting game. Politicians delivered stirring speeches, invoking glory and sacred duty. The image presented was one of chivalry reborn, a swift adventure for a glorious future. It was a compelling narrative, difficult for many young minds, eager for purpose to resist, a siren call to a supposedly grand stage where heroes would undoubtedly be made. So who answered these potent calls? Many were barely boys, ages often adjusted, faces smooth, unlined by harsh realities. They were factory workers, farmhands, clerks, students, leaving familiar comforts and youthful pursuits. Their grasp of modern warfare's true nature was tragically minimal. Initial training, often rushed, involved marching, some rifle practice, basic drills, scant preparation for the industrialized slaughter awaiting them on distant fields. It was a profound mismatch between their limited experience and the sheer brutal scale of the conflict that was inexorably drawing closer with each passing day, each step. Then came the day of departure. For many, it was a scene of public spectacle. A flurry of waving flags, cheering crowds, and the poignant strains of brass bands playing patriotic anthems. Mothers wept, sweethearts promised to wait, and younger brothers looked on with envy. Packed onto trains, or later onto ships, these recruits, now soldiers, embarked on their journey towards the unknown. Beneath the veneer of excitement and bravado, the first subtle seeds of apprehension may have begun to sprout. The laughter, perhaps a little too loud, the song, sung with a forced gaiety, the vastness of the endeavor truly started to dawn. As their journey progressed, further from home and closer to the war, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Cheering faded, replaced by different sounds, growing in insistence. A low, intermittent rumble on the horizon, like a distant thunderstorm, was perhaps the first auditory hint of the front. The sights also began to change. They passed trains heading the other way, carrying not fresh recruits but lines of bandaged, weary men. The walking wounded, their eyes reflecting a knowledge the newcomers didn't yet possess. The landscape itself, once pastoral or urban, started to look subtly, surely scarred, more desolate, hinting at the destruction that lay ahead. Closer still, the front became a tangible, unsettling sensory experience. The distant rumble resolved into the distinct thump of artillery, soon the constant, unwelcome soundtrack to their lives. A peculiar smell permeated the air. An acrid mix of smoke, chemicals, stagnant water, decay, and unwashed men in close, unsanitary confines. It was an olfactory assault, a stark warning they were entering a realm far removed from the clean, orderly world they'd left. This new world possessed its own grim, unforgettable perfumes, a signature of the suffering that was an everyday brutal occurrence there, an unwelcome greeting. Then arrival. Not a glorious battlefield, but a chaotic railhead or muddy camp behind the line. They marched, often at night, towards the trenches. The first glimpse of this infamous landscape was a shock. No heroic vistas, just desolate, scarred earth, pockmarked by craters, festooned with barbed wire, carved with endless ditches. The men already there, veterans of weeks or months, seemed different. Faces caked with mud, uniforms filthy, eyes hollow and weary. They were specters from a future these new arrivals would soon inhabit. Silent prophets of the grim, long days to come, their silence more eloquent than any words of warning could ever be. In these first hours, narratives of glory and adventure crumbled, dissolving like mist in harsh light. Romantic notions from home collided violently with the trench's brutal reality. No chivalry here, only relentless, grinding, industrialized war. The scale of noise, the constant threat of death or maiming, the filth, damp, rats, lice, an immediate, overwhelming assault on every sense and preconceived idea. The grim understanding of what it meant to be a soldier in this specific war began to dawn. It was a heavy, cold awakening to a world where survival itself was the only remaining heroic act, the romance stripped away so entirely. Let us now venture, in our minds, into the very heart of the soldier's daily existence on the Western Front, the trench. When we hear the word trench, perhaps a simple image comes to mind, a long, narrow ditch dug into the earth. But the reality, as with so much of this conflict, was far more complex, far more elaborate, and, in its own way, a testament to human ingenuity under duress. These were not mere ditches, they were extensive, subterranean networks, carefully designed, albeit grimly, to facilitate a new and dreadful form of static warfare, shaping every moment of a soldier's life, and often, indeed, his very death. Imagine these trench systems not as isolated lines, but vast, sprawling labyrinths carved into Europe's face. From Belgium's coast through northern France to the Swiss border, these earthen fortifications stretched for hundreds of miles. A colossal feat of manual labor, dug by soldiers, often under fire, with shovels and pickaxes. This immense network became a defining war feature, a stark, man-made scar on the landscape, starkly visible from afar. It symbolized the deadlock gripping nations in this terrible struggle for years, a seemingly endless earthen trap from which escape was a distant, almost unimaginable dream for those within. The fundamental design of a trench system in any sector typically involved several parallel lines, each with a specific grand purpose. At the forefront, facing no man's land and enemy fortifications, lay the front line trench. Behind this, often a few hundred yards back, was the support trench, meant to reinforce or relieve the front. Further still, another few hundred yards to the rear, one found the reserve trench, holding more troops for larger engagements or counterattack. These main lines formed the basic, stark skeleton of the overall total defensive position, a layered defense against the ever-present threat of enemy assault and bombardment. The front-line trench was the sharp end, the place of maximum danger and constant vigilance. From here, soldiers peered into the cratered wasteland of no man's land, watching for enemy movement. It was from here attacks were launched, and enemy assaults met with rifle and machine gun fire. Its primary purpose, a protected position to defend their sector and observe the foe. Life here was lived on a knife edge, death a constant, unwelcome companion. The air itself felt thick with palpable tension, and the pervasive odors of damp earth, smoke, and the metallic tang of fear, an ever-present reminder of their precarious, dangerous situation. To offer this protection, the frontline trench incorporated several key architectural features, born of hard-won, bloody experience. Facing the enemy, the foremost defensive structure was the parapet. This was essentially the front wall of the trench, a thick embankment of earth, often reinforced with sandbags, timber, or any other available materials. Its crucial role was to absorb the impact of bullets, shrapnel from exploding shells, and other projectiles, shielding the soldiers sheltering behind it. The height and thickness of the parapet were critical. Too low or too thin, and it offered scant protection against the lethal hail of all modern weaponry they now faced. Parapet construction was a continuous, exhausting task. Enemy shelling frequently demolished sections, requiring immediate perilous repair, often at night. Sandbags, millions of them, became ubiquitous Western Front building blocks. Filled with earth or clay, they were stacked meticulously into a resilient barrier. Interspersed along this wall, carefully sighted and camouflaged, were loopholes, small, protected openings. Through these, soldiers could observe enemy lines or fire rifles without undue exposure to retaliatory sniper fire or shrapnel. A tiny window onto a landscape of constant, truly lethal battlefield danger, they knew. For a soldier to effectively use these loopholes, or simply to see over the top of the parapet to engage the enemy during an assault, he needed to be elevated from the trench floor. This was the purpose of the fire step, also known as the firing step. Typically, it was a ledge or step cut into the front interior wall of the trench, running along its length. It needed to be wide enough for a man to stand on securely and at the correct height to allow him to rest his rifle on the parapet or aim through a loophole with some measure of stability. Its simple design belied its vital importance in both defensive and offensive actions taken from the whole trench line by them. Just as the parapet protected the front of the trench, a similar, though usually smaller embankment known as the parados was constructed at the very rear. The parados served several important functions. Firstly, it shielded the soldiers in the trench from shell fragments and shrapnel that might explode directly behind them, a common occurrence. Secondly, and perhaps just as importantly, it prevented the soldiers from being silhouetted against the skyline, which would have made them easy targets for enemy snipers or machine gunners, especially at dawn or dusk when light conditions were tricky for all involved indeed. Behind the immediate dangers of the front-line trench, typically situated between 70 to 100 yards further back, lay the support trenches. These mirrored the layout of the front line, but were intended to be a secondary line of defense. Their primary role was to house additional soldiers who could quickly reinforce the front line if it came under heavy attack, or indeed if a section of it was captured by the enemy. They also served as a place for frontline troops to fall back to if their own positions became untenable, providing a crucial rallying point from which counterattacks could be launched to regain any lost ground if needed. While still very much within range of enemy artillery and long-range machine gun fire, the support trenches sometimes offered a marginally less intense environment than the absolute front. Soldiers might be rotated back to the support lines for brief periods of relative respite, though respite is a highly relative term in this context. Here, they might find slightly better constructed dugouts for shelter, or perhaps a chance to perform essential tasks like cleaning weapons or attempting to get some sleep, albeit always with the knowledge that they could be called forward into the maelstrom at any given moment, by day or night, without warning. Connecting the parallel lines, front, support, and reserve trenches, and linking to vital points like HQs, aid posts, and supply dumps, was a web of communication trenches. These were not straight passages, but dug in a zigzag or traversed pattern. Their critical function, allowing relatively safer movement of men, equipment, ammo, food, water, and, tragically, the wounded, between various parts of the trench system. Without these vital arteries, each section of the front would be isolated and far more vulnerable to enemy action or simple, grinding attrition from lack of all essential supplies. The zigzag design of communication trenches was a crucial safety feature, learned through bitter trial and error. A straight trench, if hit by a shell, could see shrapnel sweep its length, causing many casualties. Also, a straight trench could be enfiladed. Enemy machine gunners, if flanking, could fire straight along it. The angled turns of a traverse trench limited shell blast radius and ensured no single stretch could be easily swept by such devastating fire. This design, while making transit slower and more awkward, was a necessary compromise to save lives in the face of ever-present explosive and ballistic threats they faced. Now, let us consider the ground beneath the soldiers' feet. In an ideal world, the floor of a trench would be dry and firm. However, the reality, particularly in the Flanders region of Belgium and parts of France, was one of relentless mud and water. To combat this, and to provide some semblance of a stable walkway, duckboards were introduced. These were essentially wooden slatted platforms, like sections of a boardwalk laid along the bottom of the trenches. Their intended purpose was simple, to try and keep the soldiers' feet out of the perennial water and cloying mud that accumulated, aiming to reduce trench foot and improve mobility and their well-being. Unfortunately, duckboards often lost the battle against elements in landscape devastation. Heavy rain quickly turned trenches into waterlogged channels, submerging them. Shell explosions blasted them to splinters or buried them under earth. They became slippery with mud and slime, tilting precariously, making passage treacherous, especially in darkness or when laden with heavy kit. Far from a perfect solution, they frequently became another hazard, another small misery adding to the deeply uncomfortable and unstable daily life. They were a constant reminder of the struggle against an unforgiving, brutal environment. Trench dimensions added to the grim experience. They were necessarily narrow, often only a few feet wide, to be a smaller shell target and more defensible. This narrowness meant soldiers lived in extremely cramped, confined conditions. Moving along a busy trench cluttered with equipment, ammo boxes, and other men was slow and awkward. This constant physical proximity with no personal space and little privacy added another layer of psychological strain to the immense pressures of combat and privation they endured daily. There was simply no escape from the press of bodies or the shared claustrophobic shared existence. Finally, trenches were inherently unstable. Dug into soil, often waterlogged and churned by shell fire, walls were prone to collapse, especially after heavy rain or explosions. Soldiers constantly shored up collapsing sections with timber, iron, or sandbags, a never-ending battle against gravity and war's destructive power. Pervasive dampness seeped into clothes, blankets, food, and bones, creating a permanently cold, clammy environment. This fostered illness and profound misery, making the trench not just a fortification, but a wretched, constantly shifting and deeply uncomfortable home for its unfortunate, weary inhabitants. We now descend deeper into the subterranean world of the World War I soldier, to explore not the dramatic assaults or heroic charges that often capture historical attention, but the far more pervasive experience, the daily grind. Life below ground was a strange paradox, a relentless oscillation between profound, soul-crushing boredom and moments of stark, unadulterated terror. It was in this monotonous rhythm, this endless cycle of waiting and mundane tasks, that much of the true misery of trench warfare was to be found, a slow erosion of spirit in a landscape of cold mud and ever-present fear. Imagine the waiting. Endless, empty hours, stretching into days, days into weeks, where the primary activity was simply existing in a damp, confined space. The silence between bombardments could be as unnerving as the shelling itself, pregnant with unspoken fears and the constant anticipation of what might come next. Soldiers would stare at the same muddy trench wall, the same patch of gray sky, their thoughts turning inwards or drifting to memories of a life that felt a million miles away. This oppressive waiting was a heavy blanket, smothering activity, dulling the senses, and often extinguishing hope itself for many young men. To combat the chaos and potential idleness, the military, by its very nature, imposed routine. A soldier's day, even in the relative quiet of a stable front line, was often strictly timetabled. From the early morning stand-to at dawn, when everyone manned the parapet in case of an enemy attack, to the allocation of various chores and duties throughout the day, life was regimented. However, this structure, while providing a framework, often consisted of tasks that were repetitive, unpleasant, and seemingly insignificant in the grand, brutal theater of modern war, the constant chipping away at the reserves of resilience. Sentry duty was a cornerstone of this routine, a vital and dreaded responsibility. For hours on end, often in 2-hour shifts, a soldier would be tasked with keeping watch, peering over the parapet or through a loophole into the desolate expanse of no man's land. This was a lonely vigil, demanding constant alertness even when exhaustion gnawed at the senses. The strain on the eyes, trying to discern movement in the gray light of dawn or the deepening shadows of dusk, was immense, and always the chilling knowledge that a moment's lapse in concentration could mean sudden death for oneself or one's unsuspecting comrades. What were they watching for, these solitary sentinels? Any sign of enemy activity, a flicker of movement suggesting a patrol, the glint of a periscope, the telltale signs of preparations for an attack, or the sudden, sharp crack of a sniper's rifle. They listened intently, too, for the sounds of digging or voices carried on the wind. In the biting cold of winter or the damp chill of a rainy night, stillness was a torment. The sentry became a frozen statue, every nerve ending alive to the subtle, often menacing, language of the front line, a silent guardian against an ever-present, unseen threat, shrouded in mist or darkness. Beyond the relative safety of their own trench, some soldiers faced the even more terrifying task of patrols in no man's land. These were almost invariably conducted under the cloak of darkness, small groups of men venturing out into the treacherous, cratered terrain that separated the opposing lines. The objectives varied, sometimes reconnaissance, to gather intelligence on enemy positions or wire defenses, sometimes to repair their own barbed wire entanglements, or to establish or relieve advanced listening posts, perilously close to the enemy's listening ears and their watchful, patiently dangerous eyes. The terror of these patrols is difficult to fully comprehend. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. Every rustle of sound could betray their position. Flares would periodically illuminate the landscape in a harsh, ghostly light, forcing the patrol to freeze, exposed and vulnerable. The crawl back to their own lines, hoping to avoid both enemy fire and the nervous sentries of their own side, was often the most harrowing part. Many men did not return, swallowed by the darkness and the myriad dangers that no man's land held, a truly terrifying and unforgiving expanse of broken earth, rusting wire, and death. Back in the trench, the work was never truly done. Trench maintenance was a constant Sisyphean struggle against the elements and enemy action. Rain would cause trench walls to sag and collapse, necessitating back-breaking repair work with shovels and sandbags. Drainage channels, always inadequate, needed to be cleared of mud and debris to prevent the trench floor from becoming an impassable quagmire. Parapets and parados, damaged by shelling or simply eroded by weather, required continuous rebuilding to maintain their protective integrity against incoming hostile fire, a task that seemed as endless as the rain that often fell there. This labor was performed in the most uncomfortable conditions imaginable. Soldiers were often knee-deep in mud, their movements restricted by the narrow confines of the trench. The physical exertion, combined with poor nutrition and the ever-present damp, took a heavy toll. Repairing a section of trench might mean handling earth contaminated with human waste, decaying matter, or the unexploded remnants of ordnance. It was dirty, exhausting, and profoundly demoralizing work. A daily battle just to keep their wretched temporary homes from literally falling apart around them. A testament to their grim, muddy perseverance each day. Amidst the mud and squalor, the soldier's rifle was his lifeline, and its care was paramount. Weapon maintenance was a ritual, drilled into every man. Rifles had to be kept scrupulously clean, free from mud and rust, to ensure they would function reliably when needed. A jam at the wrong moment could be fatal. Soldiers would spend hours painstakingly cleaning barrels, bolts, and ammunition. By this task, while essential, was yet another repetitive chore in an environment where keeping anything truly clean felt like an almost impossible and often futile endeavor that just had to be done meticulously to preserve that lifeline. Personal chores and hygiene attempts were a constant, losing battle. Proper washing was rare, water scarce and precious, was for drinking. Lice, or cooties, were a universal affliction causing intense itching and misery. Soldiers would try running a candle flame along clothing seams to kill lice, but reinfestation was swift. Writing letters home, a vital link to sanity and normality, occurred in cramped, dim dugouts, words often interrupted by the distant crump of shells, a jarring reminder of their grim present compared to the peaceful past they longed for, far away. Food in the trenches was another source of daily monotony and frequent complaint. Rations typically consisted of tinned beef, often bully beef, hardtack biscuits, bread, and jam. Fresh food was a rarity. What little hot food could be prepared was often cooked miles behind the lines and arrived cold and unappetizing after a difficult journey through communication trenches. Eating itself was an ordeal, often done amidst filth, with the constant companionship of rats and under the threat of sudden interruption by enemy action, making even a simple meal a source of considerable stress and hurried anxiety. Beyond physical hardships, the psychological grind was immense. Relentless boredom, lack of purposeful individual action for long stretches, and constant underlying anxiety took a severe toll on mental resilience. Soldiers felt trapped, cogs in a vast impersonal machine with little control over their fate. This slow erosion of spirit, this hollowing out of hope and initiative, was one of trench life's most insidious aspects. It was a quiet, creeping torment, often unrecorded in official histories of grand battles, but a profound part of the daily suffering they had to endure without respite. A mental attrition. And then, shattering the monotony, would come the terror. A sudden, deafening artillery barrage, the earth shaking, shells screaming down, turning their precarious shelter into a potential tomb. The sharp crack of a sniper's bullet, a reminder of instant random death. An alarm signaling a gas attack, the frantic scramble for primitive gas masks, or the dreaded order to go over the top. In these moments, the boredom was instantly replaced by an overwhelming primal fear, an adrenaline surge that left men trembling and exhausted in its wake, only for the waiting to eventually resume, now heavier with the fresh memory of terror, the silence more charged. Perhaps one of the most wearing aspects of this life was the sheer, unadulterated sameness of it all. Each miserable day blurred into the next, marked only by the changing shifts of sentries, the meager rations, and the familiar cycle of tedious chores. There was little sense of progress, little to look forward to beyond the vague hope of leave or the end of the war itself, an event that seemed impossibly distant. This feeling of being stuck in an unending loop of discomfort, danger, and drudgery was a heavy burden for the mind to bear, a gray, featureless landscape of time stretching before them, each dawn promising more of the same. Thus, the daily grind, or lack thereof in meaningful engagement, formed the bedrock of why it sucked to be a WWI soldier. Not just battles, horrific as they were, but this relentless, soul-sapping routine, this oscillation between anticipation and boredom, all in squalor and peril. This cumulative toll, day after weary day, week after weary week, wore down even the strongest. It left an indelible mark on those who endured it, and survived to tell their tales of misery and endurance, a testament to the grim reality of their protracted, static, and wretched existence below ground, a journey through hell. Beyond artillery's thunder, beyond battle narratives, lay a more intimate, constant, dreadful aspect of a WWI soldier's life: pervasive physical miseries. unwelcome companions clinging to every man, the unholy trinity of mud, rats, and lice. These weren't foes fought with bullets, but relentless environmental horrors. They turned daily existence into a sensory nightmare, a torment seeping into their being, day and night, a persistent assault making every moment a struggle for basic comfort, a truly awful and unavoidable daily reality they always faced. These elements, earth, vermin, parasite, formed a baseline of suffering with rarely any true escape. Enemy threats waxed and waned. These discomforts were steadfast. They respected no rank, offering grim equality of affliction. Why it sucked to be a soldier is linked to this ceaseless battle against the ground they stood on and creatures thriving within. This was a different war, one for personal peace against a creeping siege of filth, a constant irritation that wore down the spirit of every single man enduring those terrible long years. Consider the mud. On the Western Front, especially Flanders, mud wasn't merely wet earth, it was a malevolent entity. It was thick, glutinous, incredibly clinging. Not easily scraped off boots, it was a viscous porridge sucking at everything. It coated uniforms, clogged rifles, turned the landscape into a vast monochrome morass of despair. Its sickly yellowish-brown or deep gray color became the dominant shade of the soldier's world, an omnipresent, depressing reminder of their dire and unending plight in that truly wretched place. This mud was rain's unholy offspring and earth's churning by artillery. Fertile fields, with drainage, were pulverized into quagmire. Shell craters, hundreds of thousands, pocked the landscape, quickly filling with water, becoming slime pools. Clay soil, common in Flanders, held water tenaciously. Mud varied from slippery ooze to thick, glue-like paste, sometimes deep enough to swallow a man entirely, a terrifying prospect for any soldier who unfortunately slipped from the duckboards or stumbled in the dark. A grave of slime. Movement was an ordeal. Every step a struggle, mud-clutching boots, adding weight, threatening to pull them off. Soldiers heavily laden sank to knees, even waists. Horses, vital for transport, became hopelessly bogged, their struggles embedding them further. Light railways for supply buckled and sank. Energy to move a short distance was colossal, leaving men exhausted before fighting. This constant sapping of strength was a major, unspoken burden, making even simple tasks into monumental efforts of will and pure physical endurance. Mud wasn't just an impediment, it swallowed men and material. Stories tell of soldiers slipping from duckboards into deep shell crater mud and weighed by kit, unable to escape, slowly suffocating in cold slime. Rifles, ammo, supplies were lost to its depths. Retrieving anything or anyone was perilous, often futile. The fear of mud, of being consumed by it, became another constant psychological burden, a primal horror added to the many others they already faced each and every single day they spent in those awful lines. Mud's most insidious consequence was trench foot. This affliction wasn't infection, but from prolonged foot exposure to damp, cold, unsanitary conditions defining trench life. Constantly wet feet, unable to dry, constricted by tight boots, suffered restricted blood flow. This, with cold, led to tissue damage. A creeping ailment could cripple a soldier like any bullet, a silent enemy attacking from within sodden boots. A truly terrible condition to have to endure, making every step an agony, every moment a misery. Trenchfoot's progression was miserable. It began with tingling numbness, feet cold and heavy. As it worsened, they swelled, sometimes 2 or 3 times normal size. Skin turned red, then waxy white or bluish purple. Blisters and open sores developed, emitting a foul odor as flesh decayed. In severe cases, gangrene set in, turning tissue black, necessitating amputation to save life. Pain, especially as circulation attempted to return, was described by many as completely and utterly excruciating, a deep, burning agony. The army attempted to combat this scourge. Soldiers greased feet with whale oil. They worked in pairs, inspecting each other's feet. Regulations stipulated regular sock changes, but dry socks were often a luxury. Despite these measures, trench foot claimed tens of thousands of casualties. For the individual soldier, it was another misery, another way the environment seemed determined to break him, piece by painful piece from the ground up, a constant reminder of their vulnerability to the elements and the harsh, very wet conditions. If mud was misery's foundation, rats were its scurrying, unwelcome occupants. Trenches were a grim paradise for rodents. 2 main types: smaller black rat, larger, aggressive brown rat, Norway rat. Abundant food from discarded rations, waste, and, gruesomely, human remains. made the rat population explode. They thrived in dugout safety and labyrinthine trench systems, breeding astonishingly, their numbers seemingly limitless, their presence utterly unavoidable, a constant unwelcome feature of the grim landscape they inhabited. These weren't timid creatures. Soldiers' letters tell of rats grown enormous, bold, sometimes cat-sized. Gorged on war's refuse, they showed little human fear. They scurried over sleeping men, darted across dugouts in daylight, brazenly snatched food from unwary hands or packs. This fearlessness was unsettling, a reminder that in this wretched environment, man wasn't necessarily dominant, sharing his squalid home with these equally tenacious, unwelcome, and often repulsive residents, their eyes glinting in the dark. The rats' most horrifying aspect, haunting soldiers' nightmares, was their feeding on human corpses. In no man's land, fallen soldiers' bodies often lay unretrieved for days or weeks. Rats feasted on these remains. This grim reality wasn't confined to between the lines. Even in trenches, if a man was killed and his body not immediately removed, rats soon found him. This desecration of the dead added a profound layer of psychological horror to trench life's already grim conditions, a truly terrible sight to behold. Beyond the dead, rats constantly threatened living soldiers' meager food. Rations were guarded jealously, hung from dugout wires or tinned, often futile against determined rodents. Accounts, perhaps stressed exaggerated, told of rats gnawing sleeping men, fingers, ears, exposed flesh. True or not, fear was real. Their rustle and squeak in darkness was a constant, unnerving soundtrack to any rest attempt. This made relaxation impossible, adding to sleeplessness and anxiety soldiers bore, a relentless nightly torment. Rat numbers were beyond belief. Soldiers wrote of seeing swarms, eyes glinting in dugout candlelight, or feeling them run over bodies at night. Some estimated millions along the Western Front. During quiet, ground itself seemed to ripple with their movement. This infestation contributed to the general filth and decay permeating trench life, making it feel less like a military fortification and more like a vast, open sewer teeming with these repulsive, unwelcome, and disease-carrying inhabitants, a truly disgusting state of affairs for all. Attempts to control rats were largely futile, testament to their resilience. Soldiers shot them, bayoneted them, or used terriers if available. Poison was sometimes used, risking food/water contamination or sickening dogs. Despite efforts, any number reduction was temporary. For every rat killed, 10 more seemed to appear. Rats, like mud, were an enemy not truly defeated, only endured with grim, weary resignation each day, a constant battle against an overwhelming, scurrying tide of fur and teeth and beady eyes. The psychological impact of living so close to these creatures can't be overstated. They were a source of constant disgust. For some, genuine fear. The thought of what they fed on, diseases they might carry, their brazen intrusion into personal space added mental strain. Rats symbolized war's decay and degradation, a tangible manifestation of horror lurking beneath daily life's surface, a constant, scurrying reminder of filth and death surrounding them, always present in the oppressive darkness of their cramped dugouts. Then, lice. Smaller, more numerous, arguably more intimately tormenting than rats, these tiny parasites were a universal soldier affliction. Known as cooties, chaps, or arithmetic bugs, added to misery subtracted comfort multiplied rapidly, lice were inescapable. No soldier, regardless of personal cleanliness or rank, was immune. They thrived in wool uniform seams, passed easily man-to-man in crowded conditions. This ensured everyone shared this itchy misery, a constant reminder of their degraded state, a profound loss of dignity. Lice's primary torment was incessant, maddening itch from their bites. Not mild irritation, often a furious, consuming itch driving men to distraction. It made sleep difficult, impossible, interfered with duty concentration. Soldiers scratched raw, leading to skin infections, sores, which in unsanitary trenches could become serious. Constant scratching became unconscious habit, the visible sign of hidden torment every man endured, a relentless, unavoidable, and deeply personal discomfort that never seemed to truly go away. Lice mastered concealment, homing in warm, dark clothing seams, particularly thick khaki wool uniforms. They laid eggs, nits, in these same locations, ensuring continuous infestation. Even if a soldier got fresh underclothes, his outer uniform likely still teemed. Blankets, greatcoats, any fabric item offered haven. This ability to hide and multiply effectively meant efforts to rid them were often short-lived, a frustrating battle against an invisible, persistent, and ever-breeding foe that lived upon their very bodies. Soldiers developed methods to delouse, a ritual called chatting, common, run a lit candle or hot ember along clothing seams, heat killing some lice, eggs, often with audible pops. Hot baths, if available far behind lines during rest, offered temporary relief, as did steam delousing for clothing. Chemical powders were issued, effectiveness limited. These were mere skirmishes in a war they couldn't truly win while in trenches. Reinfestation was almost guaranteed upon returning to their infested dugouts and equally infested comrades. Beyond discomfort, lice were disease vectors, notably trench fever, a debilitating illness, recurring high fevers, severe headaches, leg pains, incapacitating a soldier for weeks or months. Transmitted by infected lice feces, often scratched into bites, trench fever was a significant drain on manpower. Not usually fatal, it added to sickness burden plaguing armies, a direct consequence of unsanitary conditions and ubiquitous presence of these tiny, disease-carrying tormentors. Another hidden enemy, breeding in clothes worn for warmth and supposed protection. The inability to escape lice was a profound psychological burden, a constant reminder of degraded living conditions, stripping personal dignity. Shared affliction, while fostering grim camaraderie, underscored hopelessness of individual efforts to remain clean. Lice were a great leveler, tormenting officers and enlisted men alike. This pervasive, itching plague contributed to general weariness, eroding morale, one more misery layer piled onto already overburdened shoulders of the common soldier in war's bleak, unending landscape. Thus the unholy trio, mud, rats, lice, formed a relentless physical misery baseline underpinning every other WWI soldier hardship. Clinging, energy-sapping, mud-breeding disease, bald corpse-fed rats invading space, food, countless itching lice stealing sleep, dignity, these were daily realities. They created a multi-sensory nightmare, foul smells, unsettling sounds, wretched tastes, constant irritating touch. This pervasive torment, often overshadowed by battle tales, was a fundamental reason why it truly, profoundly sucked to be there. In our continuing exploration of the grim realities faced by soldiers in World War I, we turn now to an aspect of trench life that, while often less graphically depicted than the visual horrors, was perhaps one of the most pervasive and deeply unsettling: the smell. The air itself in and around the trenches was a constant, inescapable olfactory assault, a complex miasma of decay and filth that clung to everything and everyone. This was the smell of despair, an invisible tormentor that contributed profoundly to the daily misery, a sensory signature of a world mired in stagnation and death, an ever-present, inescapable atmospheric horror that defined their days and their nights. Imagine an atmosphere so saturated with foul odors that it became the very fabric of existence, a smell so potent it could make the eyes water and the stomach churn, even for men hardened by months of exposure. There was no true escape from it. It was there when they woke, when they ate their meager rations, when they stood on sentry duty, and when they tried, often fruitlessly, to find some measure of rest in their damp dugouts. This ever-present stench was more than just unpleasant, it was a constant reminder of the squalor, the danger, and the pervasive death that defined their world in those terrible, long drawn-out, and seemingly endless years of brutal, static conflict. One of the primary contributors to this symphony of smells was stagnant water. The battle-scarred landscape, pocked with countless shell craters and carved with miles of trenches, offered few avenues for natural drainage. Rainwater, and worse, water contaminated with all manner of refuse, would collect in these depressions, transforming them into fetid pools. This standing water quickly became a breeding ground for bacteria and algae, emitting a heavy, earthy, and distinctly swamp-like odor that hung perpetually in the damp air, especially in low-lying sectors of the front, making breathing itself an unpleasant, sometimes nauseating task for the unfortunate soldiers stationed there for many weeks. This stagnant water did more than just smell foul on its own. It exacerbated the dampness that permeated everything within the trenches. The constant moisture hastened the decay of organic materials, from sandbags to wooden supports, each contributing its own note to the olfactory chorus. The smell of mold and mildew was rife, a musty, cloying scent that clung to clothing and blankets, making it impossible to ever feel truly dry or clean. This pervasive damp earth smell was a fundamental baseline, the canvas upon which other, more pungent odors were layered, creating a truly unique and awful perfume, a signature scent of that waterlogged, largely forgotten part of the world. Adding significantly to the malodor was the problem of human waste. With thousands of men living in close confinement, sanitation was a constant challenge, often a losing battle. Latrines were typically pits or trench extensions, often woefully inadequate for the numbers they served. Overflow was common, especially after heavy rain. The raw, acrid stench of sewage would drift through the trench systems, a deeply unpleasant and unavoidable reminder of the basic bodily functions that became yet another trial in this environment. It was a smell that spoke of primitive conditions and the breakdown of civilized norms, a constant affront to any sense of decency or any basic human hygiene. The siting of these latrines was often a matter of grim necessity rather than ideal planning. They were invariably close to the living and fighting areas, meaning their potent effluvia was a near-constant companion. In warmer weather, the smell would intensify, becoming almost unbearable, attracting swarms of flies which then moved freely between the latrines and the soldiers' food. Even when efforts were made to cover the waste with earth, the sheer volume produced by so many men in such a confined space ensured that the smell of excrement was a dominant feature of the trench atmosphere, a truly foul and almost physically oppressive air that clung to the lungs. The very fabric of the trenches, the millions upon millions of sandbags used to construct parapets and revetments, also contributed to the general decay. Made of jute or burlap, these bags were constantly exposed to moisture. They absorbed water, became sodden, and slowly began to rot. This process released a distinct, earthy, and somewhat musty odor, the smell of decomposing vegetable matter on a grand scale. While perhaps less offensive than some of the other components of the trench perfume, it was nonetheless a pervasive background note, reminding soldiers of the impermanence and decay all around them, a slow, inevitable decomposition mirroring the broader stagnation of the entire war front. We now turn to the most dreadful source of stench, one that haunted soldiers long after the war, the smell of decaying human bodies. In the aftermath of attacks, no man's land was often littered with the fallen, who could not be retrieved for days, weeks, or sometimes ever. As these bodies decomposed, they released a uniquely sweet, sickly, and cloying odor that was utterly unmistakable and deeply disturbing. This smell, carried on the wind, would drift into the trenches, a harrowing olfactory announcement of death's presence, a constant reminder of their own fragile mortality in that place, a place where death was both sudden and slow, and always present. The psychological impact of this particular smell was profound. It was not an abstract odor of decay, it was the smell of former comrades, friends, and fellow human beings putrefying a short distance away. Soldiers described how the wind could shift, suddenly bringing with it this ghastly perfume, triggering nausea and a deep sense of revulsion. It was a smell that became associated with fear, with loss, and with the brutal indifference of war to human dignity. Even the memory of it could be powerful enough to evoke strong physical reactions years later, an olfactory ghost that would return unbidden in dreams and quiet moments. Adding to this charnel house atmosphere was the decay of countless animals. Horses and mules, vital for transport, were frequent casualties of shell fire and harsh conditions. Their large carcasses, often difficult to remove, would lie bloated and rotting on the landscape, sometimes for extended periods. The smell of their decomposition, while different from that of human remains, was no less potent and offensive, a strong, gamey, and deeply unpleasant odor that contributed significantly to the overall miasma of death. These animal remains were another stark visual and olfactory reminder of the war's widespread, indiscriminate, and horrifyingly casual destruction of all life. The daily business of sustenance also played its part in the symphony of smells. Discarded food rations, scraps of bully beef, sodden biscuits, and peelings from any fresh vegetables that made it to the front would quickly begin to rot in the damp, muddy conditions. This decaying organic matter attracted flies and rats and emitted its own sour, pungent odors. While perhaps less overtly horrific than the smell of decomposing bodies, this constant background scent of stale and putrefying food contributed to the overall sense of squalor and neglect that permeated the trench environment, a truly unappetizing aroma that often made eating an even more miserable chore than it already was. Then there was the intimate, pervasive smell of unwashed humanity. With bathing facilities virtually non-existent at the front line, soldiers wore the same clothes for weeks, sometimes months on end. These garments became stiff with dried sweat, mud, and grime. The natural odors of closely packed bodies, unalleviated by soap and water, created a potent personal feud. This was the smell of men living under extreme duress, a close, often acrid scent, That was perhaps the one odor they became most accustomed to, yet another layer in the complex tapestry of trench smells, an unavoidable human component, the smell of humanity pushed to its very limits of endurance under extreme, unceasing pressure. Beyond the organic decay, the air often carried the sharp, acrid taint of chemicals. The lingering smell of burnt cordite from rifle and artillery fire was a frequent presence, a metallic, smoky scent that spoke of recent action. After gas attacks, the faint, insidious odors of chlorine, phosgene, or mustard gas might cling to low-lying areas or saturate the ground, a terrifying reminder of this invisible enemy. Even the disinfectants used, such as chloride of lime, added their own pungent chemical sharpness to the air, a smell that, while intended to combat filth, became part of the overall chemical assault, a sterile counterpoint to the organic rottenness all around them. It is difficult to imagine the cumulative effect of these myriad odors, a truly foul and complex bouquet of horrors that assaulted the nostrils relentlessly. No single smell predominated for long, rather, it was an ever-shifting, layered experience. One moment, the damp earth and rotting sandbags might be foremost. The next, a gust of wind would bring the stench of a nearby latrine, or the sickening sweetness of distant corpses. Soldiers developed what some called a trench nose, a partial desensitization, yet the sheer overwhelming power of the combined smells could never be fully ignored by any of them, a constant reminder of the hazardous soup they inhabited. This pervasive stench did not merely hang in the air, it seeped into everything. It impregnated soldiers' clothing, their blankets, even their hair and skin. Food, no matter how carefully wrapped, would absorb the ambient odors, tainting its taste. Letters written home carried the faint, unmistakable smell of the trenches, a ghostly, olfactory messenger to loved ones far away. There was no washing it away, no escaping its reach. It became a part of the men themselves, an invisible mark of their ordeal, a constant reminder of the filth from which they could not separate themselves, try as they might, a permanent stain upon their persons and their few, meager belongings. In conclusion, the smell of the trenches was far more than a mere discomfort. It was an integral part of the psychological warfare waged by the environment itself. It was the smell of despair, of pervasive decay, of human and animal suffering on an industrial scale. This constant, inescapable sensory barrage contributed significantly to the degradation of morale and the overall misery of the soldiers' existence. It was a potent, invisible symbol of why it so profoundly sucked to be a soldier in World War I. A memory etched not just in minds, but deep within the very senses of those who endured that foul air. An air that was thick with the unmistakable, unforgettable odors of industrial-scale suffering. He explored sights and smells of WWI trenches. Now let us listen. For the soldier, life was an unceasing assault on the ears. The trench soundscape was a brutal, relentless symphony of hell, a cacophony of industrial warfare's terrifying instruments. This constant noise wasn't just backdrop. It was an active tormentor, fraying nerves, shattering peace, contributing profoundly to the deep, wearying suckiness of their daily, precarious, and often short existence, a sonic burden. Imagine a world where true silence was a forgotten luxury, a distant memory. Even in quiet sectors, air was rarely still. Always some sound, distant rumble, sudden crack, coughs. This absence of peace, constant auditory stimulation, kept soldiers perpetually alert, a low hum of tension vibrating through them. Sleep became precious, often interrupted. The mind found little respite from ever-present reminders of danger in air, a stressor wearing men down. Artillery's ceaseless voice was the Western Front's dominant sound. For miles, its low, guttural rumble was constant, grim background music. Soldiers became deeply accustomed to it, industrialized slaughter's drumming heartbeat. This persistent thudding, sometimes miles off, sometimes closer, served as an unending reminder of immense destructive power arrayed on both sides. This power could unleash hell at any moment, without warning or specific, immediate provocation, a truly terrifying sword of Damocles above. Soldiers quickly learned the grim acoustics, a distinct difference. Friendly artillery's sharp crack, then shells' receding whisper, versus incoming enemy rounds' dreaded sound. An approaching shell often announced itself with a rising, mournful whistle or urgent, tearing shriek, a sound freezing blood. The few seconds between hearing it and impact were an eternity of helpless anticipation, a desperate hope it wasn't meant for you. For your small, fragile patch of earth, your only sanctuary. When a shell landed close, the world dissolved into overwhelming cataclysm. The explosion wasn't merely heard, it was felt. A sudden, ear-splitting, mind-numbing crash, throwing men off their feet. Concussive blast waves slammed bodies, pressing air from lungs, sometimes causing internal injury without shrapnel. Earth heaved. In that instant, other sounds were obliterated, replaced by a deafening, terrifying roar. It left soldiers disoriented, ears ringing, senses reeling from the sheer, unadulterated violence of the impact. Explosion character varied by shell. High explosive shells, for obliteration, made a deafening, ground-shaking crump. Shrapnel shells burst mid-air above trenches with a sharp, metallic crack, spraying hundreds of small metal balls downwards in deadly rain. Gas shells often arrived with a softer plop or hiss, releasing insidious, silent payloads. Each sound carried its own specific danger message, its own unique terror flavor, for men cowering below. Learning these sounds was grim, urgent survival, key to immediate threat. During a full artillery barrage, the soundscape became an unimaginable inferno. Hundreds, thousands of guns firing in concert created a continuous, overwhelming wall of sound-defying description. A physical assault, a relentless pounding shaking world foundations. Individual explosions merged into a single titanic roar for hours, sometimes days. Communication was impossible, save shouting in an ear. The sheer unceasing volume was enough to drive men to madness's brink, from pure sonic force, a terrifying experience. Beyond major barrages' intensity, sporadic, random daily shelling added its own strain. Even on a quiet day, a shell could arrive unannounced, bringing death or horrific injury. No rhyme or reason, no predicting where next round might fall. This constant, low-level threat of sudden, arbitrary sky violence meant soldiers could never truly relax. Every whistle, every distant crump was a potential doom harbinger, keeping nerves perpetually frayed, unease simmering just beneath their weary surface. Even when artillery wasn't aimed at their sector, constant thudding from nearby engagements was an ever-present reminder of war's brutal machinery. This auditory backdrop, a symphony of distant destruction, made true peace impossible. It seeped into quiet moments, a persistent bass note in their lives' soundtrack, ensuring war was never out of mind. This ceaseless, low-frequency earth and air vibration contributed to pervasive weariness and gradual erosion of soldiers' mental fortitude and any lingering sense of calm. Distinct from artillery's chaos was the machine gun's sharp, menacing rattle, its rapid mechanical rhythm like a drill or monstrous sewing machine linked with attacking infantry and deadly defensive fire. Staccato bursts spewing hundreds of rounds per minute were terrifyingly efficient. Hearing it often meant men advancing across no man's land or an enemy attack sweeping their lines. It was a signal for immediate, desperate action, its urgent metallic threat a harbinger of sudden death. Machine gun fire sweeping a battlefield was chilling. Attackers in open heard bullets terrifying rip passing close, deadly chatter of multiple guns creating overlapping fire arcs. For defenders, their own machine guns covering fire could be grimly reassuring, but also painted them as priority enemy targets. Sheer lead volume a machine gun put in air made its distinctive sound, one of the most feared on the Western Front. It was a deal of rapid, widespread death whose song soldiers dreaded. Contrast to artillery's roar or machine gun's sweep, an individual rifle's crack carried more personal, direct menace. Whether a sniper's sudden, sharp report, aimed with deadly precision, or sporadic fire exchange between opposing lines, rifle shots were a constant soundscape feature. Each crack reminded of a single human adversary, sighting down a barrel, intent on killing. This sound, less overwhelming than artillery, possessed an unsettling intimacy. A direct threat, aimed specifically at them, not just the general area. Soldiers became unwilling connoisseurs of bullets' sounds in flight. A bullet passing very close might make a sharp, vicious crack, like a whip snapping as it broke sound barrier near the ear. Others, further or slower, might produce a distinct hiss, zip, or mournful whine. These were intimate danger sounds, whispers of mortality arriving any moment from any direction. Learning to instinctively duck or take cover at these fleeting sounds became a deeply ingrained subconscious survival reflex for all those in the line. During an attack or determined defensive stand, many rifles firing together, volley fire, added to the cacophony. While not as continuous as machine gun fire, the ragged, rolling thunder of hundreds of rifles discharging simultaneously or in quick succession created a formidable barrage of noise and hot lead. This sound, often accompanied by shouts and cries of men in desperate combat, painted a vivid auditory picture of intense, close-quarters struggles characterizing assaults on well-entrenched positions. Amidst combat sounds, there were also mundane, yet significant, noises of human activity in daily trench life. Rhythmic thuds of pickaxes, shovels, as men endlessly repaired extended fortifications, clang of tools against tins, hammering of wooden dugout supports, slosh of boots through mud, low murmur of conversations. They spoke of routine, labor, simple human need to maintain semblance of order amidst ever-present chaos. These were quiet beats in the loud symphony, the sounds of men simply trying to survive. But when battle joined, human sounds took a terrifying new dimension. Officers shouted commands, strained, hoarse, struggled above the din. Sharp, shrill whistle blasts pierced air, signaling the moment to leave trench safety, advance into enemy fire. A sound many dreaded more than any other. Then, primal battle cries, yells of aggression, fear, or desperate courage, as men surged forward or met an oncoming enemy assault, a raw outpouring of human emotion in the face of extreme, mortal danger and utter chaos. Perhaps most distressing, unforgettable human sounds were cries of wounded, dying, agonizing moans, screams for help, calls from mothers often drifted across no man's land after an attack, or emanated from dressing stations, field hospitals behind lines. Unable to reach these men, or forced to listen to comrades' suffering, soldiers found these sounds deeply harrowing. They were raw, unfiltered testament to war's human cost, a pained soundtrack haunting quiet hours, troubled sleep of those hearing them, a truly awful burden. Sleep, essential human need, became precious, elusive in such environment. Relentless noise, from distant rumble to sudden violent explosions, made deep, restful sleep almost impossible for long. Soldiers snatched moments of exhausted slumber, but senses remained alert, ready to be jolted by any new threat. This chronic sleep deprivation contributed significantly to physical and mental exhaustion, reducing ability to cope with trench warfare's immense stresses, making them weary, old beyond their actual years upon this earth. Shell shock emerged in WWI for psychological/neurological symptoms in soldiers from trench horrors. Constant auditory assault was key. Complex, not solely noise-caused. Unceasing bombardment, concussive explosion force, sheer terror from the soundscape played an undeniable role. It recognized human mind and nervous system limits to enduring sustained, intense sonic emotional trauma. A new wound, invisible but debilitating, born from this war's unique, terrible pressures, a malady of the modern, industrialized battlefield. Many soldiers suffered direct physical noise consequences. Persistent tinnitus, constant ear ringing/buzzing was common, sometimes leading to partial or total deafness. Sudden loud explosions could rupture eardrums. Beyond direct auditory injuries, noise contributed to heightened anxiety, jumpiness, inability to relax. Men flinched at any sudden sound, nerves worn raw by endless barrage. These were physical, mental scars, left by Hell's Symphony, a constant reminder of violence endured and witnessed daily. And paradoxically, silence periods after intense bombardment could be just as unnerving, if not more. Sudden absence of familiar, deafening roar created eerie, unnatural stillness. Ears, accustomed to barrage, strained to interpret this new quiet. Was it prelude to an attack? Momentary lull before greater storm? This heavy, pregnant silence was often thick with tension, foreboding auditory equivalent of a hurricane's ICOM, a deeply unsettling pause in war's relentless, violent rhythm of terrifying noise and destruction. The relentless, inescapable nature of this symphony of hell was fundamental to what made being a WWI soldier so wretched, an assault offering no quarter, day or night. It eroded mental well-being, shattered physical peace, contributed to pervasive atmosphere of stress, fear, exhaustion. Noise was more than sound. It was audible manifestation of war's destructive power, a constant, inescapable reminder of life's precariousness, ever-present proximity of violent death in those terrible, echoing trenches of the front line. Recounting Trent's soundscape, we understand soldiers' ordeal more deeply. Distant thuds, ear-splitting crashes, machine guns' mechanical rattle, rifles' sharp crack, haunting human cries all wove into constant fear, misery soundtrack. This auditory torment, making sleep luxury, peace impossible, profoundly contributed to shell-shock psychological burden, underscored daily, grinding suckiness of their existence. Noise was a weapon itself, slowly breaking spirits amidst mudblood of that protracted and terrible war. In the grim catalog of World War I's miseries, a new and particularly insidious terror emerged, one that drifted silently on the breeze, an invisible enemy that attacked not with explosive force, but with chemical malevolence. This was gas warfare, a horrifying innovation that forever changed the face of combat. It ushered in an era of unprecedented fear, transforming the battlefield into a place where the very air soldiers breathed could become a deadly poison, a silent, creeping threat that defied conventional understanding of how wars were fought, a terrifying unknown. The introduction of poison gas on a large scale was met with initial disbelief, then outrage. It seemed to violate even the brutal, unwritten codes of warfare, representing a descent into a new kind of barbarity. For the soldiers in the trenches, it added a terrifying new dimension to their already precarious existence. No longer was danger solely from bullets or shells. Now it could come as an ethereal cloud, seeping into dugouts, clinging to the earth, and bringing with it agonizing suffering or a slow, suffocating death, a truly unseen and dreadful horror. The grim dawn of this new era of warfare broke notably in April 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres. It was here that German forces released a massive cloud of chlorine gas against Allied positions. Soldiers watched in bewildered apprehension as an eerie greenish-yellow mist rolled towards them across no man's land, carried by a gentle wind. There was no explosion, no warning shriek of shells, just this silent, unnatural cloud advancing, bringing with it an unknown and soon-to-be deeply feared, insidious form of attack. Initial reactions among the Allied troops ranged from morbid curiosity to outright confusion. Some thought it was a smokescreen for an infantry assault, but as the cloud enveloped them, the dawning horror began. Men started coughing violently, clutching their throats, their eyes burning. Panic erupted as soldiers, choking and gasping for air, stumbled back in disarray, their lungs afire. The true, hideous nature of this new weapon became terrifyingly apparent, not through understanding, but through its agonizing, unavoidable physical effects. In those first horrific encounters, there was little effective protection. Soldiers resorted to desperate, primitive measures. They were ordered to hold handkerchiefs or rags soaked in water, or even urine, over their faces, based on the rudimentary chemical understanding that these might neutralize some of the gas. While offering minimal, if any, real defense against the suffocating clouds, these acts highlighted the sheer desperation and the urgent, unmet need for some form of genuine protection against this terrifying, silent, airborne chemical assault. The advent of gas warfare spurred a frantic technological race to develop effective countermeasures. Early gas masks were often simple pads of cotton waste soaked in chemicals, tied crudely over the nose and mouth. These quickly evolved into more complex hoods, and eventually respirators with filtered canisters designed to neutralize various chemical agents. However, these masks were often uncomfortable, difficult to breathe in, and severely limited visibility and communication, becoming a misery in themselves, albeit a necessary, if dreaded one, for survival. Chlorine gas, one of the first to be deployed on a massive scale, was a heavy, greenish cello gas with a pungent odor, often likened to bleach or pineapple. Being denser than air, it would sink into trenches and low-lying areas, seeking out its victims. Its primary target was the respiratory system. Inhaling chlorine caused a violent irritation of the throat and lungs, leading to fits of coughing, choking, and a terrifying sensation of drowning, as the lungs filled with fluid. Death, when it came, was often slow and truly agonizingly suffocating. Phosgene represented a more insidious and lethal threat, often colorless, with a deceptively mild smell sometimes compared to moldy hay or freshly cut grass. It was harder to detect than chlorine. Crucially, its effects could be delayed for hours after exposure. A soldier might inhale phosgene without immediate severe symptoms, only to succumb later as his lungs gradually filled with fluid, leading to respiratory failure and death by suffocation. This delayed action made it particularly terrifying, a silent killer that struck when least expected, indeed. Perhaps the most infamous and feared chemical agent of World War I was mustard gas, or ypedite, first used extensively by the Germans in 1917. It was not primarily a lung irritant in the same way as chlorine or phosgene, though it could damage the respiratory tract. Mustard gas was a vesicant, a blistering agent, an oily, yellowish-brown liquid that evaporated slowly. It had a distinctive smell, variously described as being like garlic, horseradish, or indeed mustard, though often faint and easily missed in battle, a truly insidious chemical weapon. The effects of mustard gas were horrific and agonizingly slow to appear. Sometimes hours after exposure, it caused severe chemical burns and large, painful blisters on any exposed skin. If it got into the eyes, it could cause intense irritation, temporary or even permanent blindness. Inhaled, it would burn the lining of the throat and lungs, leading to a harsh cough and further internal blistering. Unlike other gases, it offered little chance of immediate escape or quick recovery. Its legacy was one of prolonged, awful, deep suffering. The burns from mustard gas were deep and slow to heal, often becoming infected. The pain was relentless. What made it particularly diabolical was its persistence. The oily liquid would contaminate clothing, equipment, and the ground itself for days, even weeks, under certain conditions. This meant that areas shelled with mustard gas remained dangerous long after the attack, and unwary soldiers could be poisoned merely by touching contaminated surfaces or resting on affected soil, a lingering, unseen trap that continued to claim its many helpless victims. Beyond these major killers, other chemical agents were also employed. Tear gases, such as xylobromide, were used to harass and temporarily incapacitate, causing intense eye irritation and uncontrolled weeping. Sneezing gases, like diphenylchloroarsine, were arsenical compounds designed to penetrate early gas masks and cause violent sneezing, coughing, and vomiting, forcing soldiers to remove their masks and thus expose themselves to more lethal agents that might be mixed in the attack. These were often dubbed mask breakers for this very insidious and dangerous purpose. The warning for a gas attack was a sound that struck terror into every heart. Shouts of "gas, gas," the urgent clanging of gongs, the blare of klaxons, or the sight of gas alarm rockets bursting in the sky, these were the signals of impending doom. What followed was a scene of frantic, desperate activity. Soldiers, their faces etched with fear, would fumble with their gas masks, struggling to adjust them correctly in precious seconds. The slightest mistake, the smallest tear or ill-fitting seal could mean a terrible death or some agonizing injury. Life inside a gas mask was a claustrophobic, isolating ordeal. The air was hot and difficult to draw through the filter, making every breath a conscious effort, especially during physical exertion. Vision through the eyepieces was often fogged or distorted, severely limiting awareness of surroundings. Communication became almost impossible. Shouts were muffled, orders misunderstood. The soldier was cut off, encased in his own small, steamy, uncomfortable world, acutely aware of his vulnerability should the mask fail or the deadly gas linger too long. For those caught without a mask or whose mask was faulty or put on too late, the experience was hellish. The first sensation was often the acrid smell, then the burning in the eyes, nose, and throat. Lungs felt as if they were on fire, each breath a searing pain. Vision blurred and a desperate, uncontrollable coughing would begin as the body tried to expel the poison. Panic would set in as the ability to breathe diminished, a primal terror of suffocation gripping the unfortunate victim, a truly ghastly and deeply terrifying feeling. Death from gas was rarely quick or merciful. Chlorine and phosgene caused the lungs to fill with fluid, essentially drowning the victim from the inside over hours or even days. Mustard gas victims endured prolonged agony from burns, blindness, and respiratory failure. The gassed men presented horrific sights, skin blistered and raw, eyes swollen shut, gasping for every torturous breath. Their suffering was a stark testament to the cruelty of this new form of warfare, a far cry from any notion of a clean or heroic death on the bloody battlefield. The aftermath of a gas attack was a scene of grim desolation. The ground itself could remain contaminated and dangerous for extended periods, especially after a mustard gas bombardment. Pockets of heavier-than-air gas might linger in shell holes or low-lying sections of trench, an invisible threat to the unwary. And then there were the casualties, the dead, the dying, and the lines of temporarily blinded men, hands on the shoulders of those in front, shuffling painfully towards aid stations, a haunting procession of suffering and unimaginable despair. The psychological impact of gas warfare was profound and unique. Unlike bullets or shells, gas was an invisible, insidious enemy. It seeped silently into trenches, defying traditional fortifications in the cover of darkness. It preyed on the most basic human need, the need to breathe. This unseen, intangible threat fostered a particular kind of terror, a feeling of utter helplessness against an enemy that could not be fought directly, only endured, or with luck avoided, by the timely donning of a mask that was itself a profound torment. The constant threat of a gas attack created an atmosphere of pervasive anxiety. Every soldier lived in fear of the sudden alarm, the frantic scramble for their mask. The direction of the wind became a source of constant worry as it could carry the deadly clouds towards them. Even with a mask on, there was no true peace of mind. The fear of leaks, of the filter failing, or of the gas being one for which the mask offered little protection was always present. This underlying tension added significantly to the daily stress and terrible mental strain of trench life. For those who were gassed and survived, the ordeal often left long-term physical and psychological scars. Chronic respiratory problems, damaged eyesight, and persistent skin conditions were common. Mentally, the experience could lead to what was sometimes termed gas neurosis, a state of heightened anxiety, nightmares, and an intense phobia of gas or even strong smells. The memory of choking, burning, or witnessing others suffer in such a way was not easily erased, haunting survivors for the rest of their now often shortened and painful lives. Mass warfare therefore added a particularly cruel and terrifying layer to the already extensive list of reasons why it truly sucked to be a soldier in World War I. It transformed the very air they breathed into a potential weapon, introducing an element of chemical horror that felt profoundly unnatural and uniquely malevolent. It changed the nature of fear itself, making the unseen and the silent as deadly, if not more so, than the loud and visible threats of conventional weaponry, a truly awful development in the history of all human, brutal conflict. In the end, poison gas stood as a potent symbol of World War I's descent into new realms of industrialized barbarity. While not ultimately decisive in winning the war, its legacy was one of widespread terror, agonizing suffering, and science perverted for destructive ends. For the common soldier, it was another silent, invisible demon to face, making his wretched existence in the trenches an even more profound and terrifying journey through a chemical hell he could not truly escape. A final, awful testament to the war's true and lasting cruelty. Of all dreadful World War I experiences, few evoke such chilling doom as going over the top. This phrase, synonymous with futile, sacrificial bravery, was when men left trench sanctuary to advance across no man's land towards enemy lines. It was the ultimate courage test, and for many their final act. It epitomized the brutal intersection of duty and near-certain death, a moment seared into the collective memory of that devastating, very long conflict. These charges often stemmed from strategic desperation or high command's misunderstanding of trench realities. Generals, far from the front, clung to outdated offensive notions, believing numbers and élan could overcome machine guns and wire. For men ordered to attack, it felt like being thrown into a meat grinder, a ghastly ritual with a predictable, bloody outcome. It was a grim calculus where their lives seemed to be expendable counters in a vast, indifferent game of attrition and utter futility. The order to attack spread through trenches like a cold dread, sometimes anticipated, preceded by days of intense artillery or stockpiled supplies, other times more sudden. Its effect was profound. A hush might fall, or forced, brittle cheerfulness surface. Men looked at each other, unspoken knowledge of what lay ahead passing between them, a shared sentence of peril. It was a moment where the abstract nature of war became terrifyingly personal and so very immediate. In hours or minutes before 0 hour, a flurry of last-minute preparations occurred. Equipment was checked, rifles cleaned, bayonets fixed, ammo pouches filled. Some scribbled a hasty final letter home entrusted to a friend who might survive. Often a tot of rum was given, liquid courage to steady nerves, though its effects were fleeting against what was to come. These were small rituals, attempts to impose order on the edge of unimaginable chaos and certain danger that awaited them all then. Each soldier was laden like a pack animal, his uniform, personal items, rifle, bayonet, around 120 ammo rounds, grenades, entrenching tool, full water bottle, iron rations, then the gas mask in its satchel, perhaps extra items like wire cutters if his role demanded. This immense weight, often 60 pounds or more, was a terrible hindrance in no man's land's mud and chaos. It was a burden designed for war, but a cruel impediment to survival when speed and true agility were needed most. A major attack was often preceded by days of intense artillery bombardment, millions of shells. Theory: destroy enemy wire, demolish trenches, demoralize defenders. Reality: bombardments frequently failed to cut wire effectively, instead churning no man's land into an even more impassable morass of craters and mud. It also served as an unambiguous announcement to the enemy that an attack was imminent, ensuring they were fully prepared, their machine guns sighted and truly ready for the assault. As 0 hour designated attack time drew closer, unbearable tension gripped waiting men. Their artillery might still hammer or an eerie, expectant silence descend. Every soldier was acutely aware of the ticking clock, each second stretching to an eternity. Nervous coughs, a rifle bolt's metallic click, a prayer's hushed murmur, these sounds punctuated the heavy, suffocating anticipation. It was a shared, silent agony of waiting for the inevitable signal to advance into the waiting storm. Internally, each man wrestled his demons. Fear was palpable, a cold stomach knot, racing heart, dry mouth. Some experienced strange detachment, as if observing themselves. Adrenaline surged, heightening senses, yet time seemed to slow. primal survival instinct warred with ingrained discipline and fear of showing cowardice before comrades. It was a profound internal battle, fought in the cramped confines of the trench, just moments before facing the external, physical one that surely awaited. In those final, suspended moments, thoughts turned home. Vivid images of loved ones, mothers, wives, sweethearts, children flashed through minds. A fleeting memory of a peaceful summer's day, stark contrast to their hellish reality. Some clutched Bibles or crucifixes, murmuring silent prayers for deliverance or strength. Others adopted stoic, fatalistic resignation, accepting their fate was out of their hands, in the lap of war's unforgiving gods, a quiet surrender to the grim inevitable. Comradeship, forged in trench life's shared miseries, took poignant intensity. A nervous glance with a mate, clasped hand, roughly muttered encouragement, small gestures spoke volumes. An unspoken bond between these men, united by the common ordeal they faced. They were in it together, for better or worse, often for the final time. This shared experience, this collective march towards an uncertain, terrifying fate, was a powerful, if grim, form of human connection in the very face of death. NCOs, sergeants, corporals, and junior officers bore heavy responsibility. They too felt fear's icy grip. But duty was to lead, inspire confidence, ensure the attack went forward. They moved among men, offering last words of instruction or encouragement, anxieties masked by resolve. Their role? Be first over the parapet, set the example, urge men into the storm of steel and fire. They were the shepherds, leading their flock into a valley of almost certain death and utter destruction. Then, the sound cutting through tension like a knife, an officer's high-pitched, shrill whistle blast. Sometimes a single piercing note, other times short, urgent blasts. This was it, 0 hour. The signal not to be ignored, the command propelling men from dreadful anticipation to desperate action. It was the sound that, for many, marked their life's very last moment. The final call to a grim, bloody duty. He would return from it unscathed if they returned at all, most likely. Hearts pounding, legs like lead, the first soldier wave heaved up trench ladders or scrambled over the sandbagged parapet. This was going over the top, leaving the trench's relative grim safety, exposing themselves fully to enemy gaze and guns. A moment of supreme vulnerability, a transition from cover into no man's land's stark, open killing ground. It was a terrifying first step into the maelstrom of battle, a deliberate move towards unimaginable danger and certain probable death. First sensation in no man's land, shocking exposure. After weeks in trenches, confined world, open sky and wide, desolate expanse felt alien, terrifyingly vast. Nowhere to hide. Landscape, churned by shell fire into a hellish panorama of mud, water-filled craters, shattered tree stumps, offered scant cover. They were truly out in the open, completely at the mercy of the enemy's awaiting, watchful fire. It was a sudden, brutal immersion into a landscape designed purely for mass killing. Almost immediately they met barbed wire, vast, tangled belts, often in complex patterns, protected enemy trenches. Artillery was meant to cut paths but frequently failed or made only small, easily defended gaps. Soldiers, weighed by gear, struggled with sharp, rusty strands often snagged. Men caught on wire were helpless, easy targets for enemy machine gunners and riflemen. It was a brutal, stationary trap in the midst of a supposedly mobile attack. A cruel, painful impediment. Then machine guns opened up. From carefully sighted, concrete-reinforced emplacements, enemy gunners, likely weathered bombardment in deep dugouts, unleashed a murderous hail of bullets. The distinctive, terrifying rattle of multiple machine guns sweeping back and forth across advancing lines was industrial-scale slaughter sound. Men fell in swathes, cut down like corn. The air filled with bullets zip and crack, a deadly invisible storm that tore through human flesh with such brutal efficiency. Not just machine guns. Enemy riflemen, picking targets, added to the fusillade. Snipers, concealed SOT officers or NCOs to disrupt command. Enemy artillery, knowing attack was underway, often laid a barrage in no man's land or on attackers' own lines, catching subsequent waves. It was a 360-degree storm of lethal projectiles, a maelstrom from which there seemed no escape, only a grim, desperate plod forward into its very heart, hoping against hope to somehow just survive. The sight of comrades falling was a profound psychological shock. Men joked with minutes before suddenly crumpled or were blown apart. Instinct to stop, help a wounded friend was strong, but orders were almost always to press on, maintain attack momentum, however futile. Soldiers stepped over dead and dying, a horrifying experience seared into memories. It was a constant, brutal reminder of their own fragile mortality in the face of overwhelming, truly indiscriminate violence. The advance, if it could be called that, was often made in utter chaos. Noise was deafening, continuous roar of explosions, machine guns, rifles, shouts. Smoke from shell bursts, sometimes their own smoke screens, obscured vision, adding to disorientation. Formations, carefully rehearsed, quickly broke down as men sought cover or navigated obstacles and fallen comrades. It was less an organized attack than a desperate, stumbling, and often leaderless rush into a wall of lethal fire. Progress across no man's land was agonizingly slow. Churned-up mud, sometimes knee-deep or worse, sucked at boots, exhausting them. Shell craters formed formidable obstacles, forcing detours or perilous scrambles. All the while, enemy fire continued relentlessly. It felt, many survivors reported, like wading through thick treacle while pelted with red-hot shrapnel. Each yard gained was paid for in blood, a testament to such tactics' brutal inefficiency against well-prepared defenses. For the very few who survived crossing and reached enemy frontline trench, the ordeal was far from over. They often found defenders waiting, relatively unscathed by artillery. What followed was brutal, close-quarters fighting, bayonets, grenades, trench clubs, fists, desperate, savage encounters in narrow, confined spaces, often amidst bodies of fallen comrades in the enemy. Survival here was raw, animalistic ferocity and sheer luck, a primitive struggle for one's life itself. But for most attackers, enemy trench remained unattainable. They were cut down in no man's land, bodies strewn across desolate, pockmarked earth. Wounded lay where they fell, sometimes hours or days, enduring pain, thirst, horror of continued shelling or sniper fire. Cries for help often unanswered, lost in battle's din, or because rescue was impossible under heavy fire. It was a lonely, agonizing end, a truly horrific fate for so many brave, but ultimately doomed, very young men. Casualty rates in over-the-top attacks were often catastrophically high, not uncommon for battalions to lose 50, 70, even 90% of attacking strength in hours, sometimes minutes. For this immense human life sacrifice, territorial gains were frequently minimal. A few yards of shattered trench, perhaps, or often nothing. The grim arithmetic of attrition was stark, its human cost almost beyond comprehension. A terrible waste of a generation of many young men. For survivors, psychological impact was devastating. They carried haunting charge images, sight of friends dying, overwhelming fear, chaos. Many suffered severe trauma, shell shock. Feelings of guilt, why me, not them, were common. The phrase, lions led by donkeys, gained currency, reflecting soldiers' courage versus perceived incompetence of some in high command, who ordered these futile, extremely costly, and often pointless frontal attacks against strong, prepared positions. Sheer, soul-crushing futility of repeated frontal assaults was perhaps the bitterest pill for the common soldier. They performed acts of suicidal bravery, advancing into near-certain death or mutilation, often for pointless or unattainable objectives. This sense of being an expendable cog in a vast, indifferent, brutally inefficient military machine contributed profoundly to the feeling their sacrifice was meaningless. It was a deep, corrosive despair that ate away at their very own souls. Going over the top became the defining, nightmarish image of Western Front combat. It encapsulated the horror, bravery, futility, and immense human cost of World War I. A ritual of sacrifice, repeated on an industrial scale, that seared itself into collective consciousness. It symbolized the essence of why it so profoundly sucked to be an ordinary soldier caught in that dreadful, seemingly unending conflict. A true hell on earth for all those unfortunate enough to experience it directly firsthand. In trench warfare's cold calculus, going over the top is stark testament to soldiers' horrific realities. Tension, terror, charge into machine gun fire, almost inevitable death or maiming for so many, epitomized tragic human potential waste. This fatal charge, undertaken with grim courage time and again, is perhaps the ultimate reason why the Great War was such an unparalleled experience of profound suckiness for those who fought it. It was a duty that led almost certainly to an early cold grave. Beyond battle's immediate terror, the WWI soldier faced a siege from within and without his body. Wounds from new weaponry were horrific. Equally insidious were diseases thriving in trench squalor. Compounding this was often rudimentary, overwhelmed medical care. This chapter delves into the grim trinity of wounds, illness, and the desperate fight for healing, a core reason why it truly sucked to be there. It was a constant battle for survival even when the guns were briefly silent all around them. For those in trenches, injury or sickness was a constant, unwelcome companion, a shadow as large as any enemy. A minor scratch could mean slow death, a cough, fatal illness's first sign. The line between life and agonizing decline was terrifyingly thin. This pervasive vulnerability to physical breakdown, often far from sophisticated medical help, contributed immensely to the psychological burden every man carried. It was an underlying fear that permeated their entire wretched daily existence. Artillery shells were great war killers. Their shrapnel inflicted devastating wounds. A shell explosion blasted jagged metal fragments everywhere. Red-hot, sharp steel pieces tore through flesh, bone, creating ragged, multiple injuries. Unlike clean bullet wounds, shrapnel carried dirt, clothing, debris deep into the body, making infection almost certain. The randomness of these injuries added to their horror. No body part was truly safe from their brutal, tearing impact when shells burst nearby or overhead. A soldier hit by shrapnel might suffer numerous punctures, deep lacerations, or dramatic limb amputation by blast force. Shock to the system was immense. Men could be peppered with dozens of small fragments, each a potential source of pain and infection. The sound of an incoming shell, then shrapnel's rain, was prelude to agony's cries and stretcher bearers' desperate work. These wounds were industrial warfare's hallmark, its brutal efficiency in maiming vulnerable human flesh. Bullet wounds, from rifles or relentless machine gun chatter, were another common horror. High-velocity rifle bullets traveled far with lethal force, piercing helmets, shattering bones. Machine gun bullets, in rapid succession, could cut a man in half or stitch fatal perforations across his body. Depending where they struck, bullets caused catastrophic internal damage, hemorrhage, or left a soldier crippled for life, if he managed to survive the initial devastating impact at all, which many did not. Less frequent than shell or bullet injuries, bayonet wounds were gruesome, resulting from desperate, brutal close-quarters combat, often in trench raid chaos or a charge reaching enemy lines. A bayonet, a long, sharp blade on a rifle, was for piercing, thrusting. Wounds it inflicted were deep, often penetrating vital organs, with high risk of severe internal bleeding shock. They spoke of primal, face-to-face savagery, a visceral horror unique to those moments of terrible, truly desperate struggle. Beyond primary threats, soldiers faced other combat injuries. Grenade fragments peppered bodies with small, painful wounds like shrapnel, but often closer. Burns were horrific, from exploding ammo, flamethrowers, a terrifying weapon, or overturned cookers in attack chaos. Blunt force trauma from collapsing trench walls, falling debris during bombardments, or being thrown by explosions also took its toll. This caused concussions, broken bones, and internal injuries that were often unseen but deadly. The ubiquitous Western Front mud was more than an impediment, it was a deadly infection incubator. Trenches were often waterlogged ditches filled with vile mixture of earth, human waste, decaying matter, war detritus. This filthy, bacteria-laden environment meant any skin break, major combat wound, or minor cut was almost guaranteed to be contaminated. The ground soldiers fought on was their enemy for wound care. It was a constant seeping threat to any open injury, however small or seemingly quite trivial. In WWI's pre-antibiotic era, infection was a soldier's greatest post-injury fear. Wounds from Flanders' manured soil, rich in tetanus, gas, gangrene spores, festered with horrifying speed. Gas gangrene, a hideous affliction, caused tissues to swell with foul gas, decaying rapidly. Without effective ways to combat these aggressive bacterial infections, a wound treatable today often meant slow, agonizing death, or desperate amputation. It was a race against a swift internal putrefaction with few good possible outcomes. The soldier's body, often weakened by poor nutrition, stress, exposure, waged a desperate battle against overwhelming infections. Fever raged. Area around the wound became inflamed, swollen, excruciatingly painful. Medical staff did what they could with carbolic acid or iodine, but these were often insufficient against deeply embedded bacteria. For many, it was a losing fight. Their systems, already strained, simply could not overcome the relentless tide of sepsis following even minor wounds. Beyond battlefield violence, disease was a constant, insidious trench enemy. Cramped, unsanitary living conditions, thousands of men packed near mud, rats, lice, contaminated water, created perfect breeding ground for debilitating illnesses. These sicknesses swept through units with alarming speed, incapacitating many soldiers, adding another misery layer to their grim existence. It was a war fought on another front, this one silently, within their own weakened and vulnerable, fragile human bodies. Dysentery, an intestinal infection, was rampant, caused by bacteria via contaminated food, water, or flies. From latrines to food, it led to severe, often bloody, diarrhea, abdominal pain, fever, dehydration. In trenches, where hygiene was abysmal, clean water a luxury, outbreaks were frequent, widespread. The condition was deeply unpleasant, weakening, and made men more susceptible to other infections. It was a humiliating, exhausting affliction, stripping men of their strength and their human dignity. Trench fever, a debilitating illness from body lice infesting nearly every soldier, was another common scourge. Onset often sudden, high fever, severe headache, shivering, intense leg and back pain, particularly shins. Though rarely fatal, trench fever caused prolonged illness, with recurring fever bouts for weeks or months. It significantly reduced soldiers' fighting effectiveness, contributed to the general sickness burden plaguing armies. It was another misery delivered by their tiny, unwelcome bedfellows. We have spoken of trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to damp and cold. Beyond the initial pain and swelling, it created an ideal entry point for infection. The damaged, waterlogged skin would often crack and blister, allowing bacteria from the surrounding filth to invade. This could lead to severe cellulitis, ulceration, and, if gangrene set in due to compromised circulation and infection, amputation of toes, the foot, or even the lower leg was a grimly frequent outcome, a terrible price for cold, wet, and aching feet. While respiratory ailments were common, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 brought new devastation. This virulent influenza strain swept crowded troop concentrations on both sides with terrifying speed. Soldiers, weakened by war's stresses, were highly susceptible. Flu caused high fevers, pneumonia, and in many cases rapid death. It killed more worldwide than the war itself. Trenches were no sanctuary from its lethal reach. It was another invisible enemy, striking down the fit and the weary alike without any discrimination. Other ailments plaguing soldiers were many. Skin diseases like scabies, impetigo were rife, from lice, inability to maintain cleanliness, persistent coughs, bronchitis from cold, damp air exposure, dental problems, common, poor diet, no care access. Even sexually transmitted infections from leave became significant, adding another complication layer and ill health to already burdened medical services. Each was a small misery, combining into a larger tapestry of daily physical suffering for them. When a soldier was wounded, a perilous journey through the chain of evacuation began. Initial first aid might be self-applied or given by a comrade, often a simple field dressing hastily applied under fire. Stretcher bearers, displaying immense bravery, then tried to carry casualties back from the front through mud and shell fire to the regimental aid post. RAP. This first stop was usually in a frontline trench or ruined building, offering very basic, immediate care only by the medical officer on the immediate scene. From the RAP, the wounded, if condition allowed and transport available, moved further back to an advanced dressing station, ADS, or main dressing station, MDS. Still relatively close to fighting, often within enemy artillery range, housed in battered farmhouses, dugouts, or tents. Here, medical officers and orderlies, under immense pressure, often with inadequate supplies, attempted more thorough assessments, triage, and basic surgical interventions. It was a chaotic, desperate, and bloody environment. Primary goals at forward medical stations: control hemorrhage, clean wounds as best possible, provide pain relief, morphine if available, stabilize patients for further evacuation. Antiseptics like carbolic acid or iodine were used, but effectiveness against deep contamination was limited. Staff were constantly overwhelmed by sheer casualty numbers arriving after an attack. They made heartbreaking decisions about who to treat first, who might survive, who was beyond their limited, often desperate help. Critical factor making WWI wounds so deadly: complete absence of antibiotics like penicillin, discovered later. Without these miracle drugs, doctors had no effective weapon against systemic bacterial infections. Once infection took hold, particularly virulent strains causing gas gangrene or tetanus, the body was largely on its own. This helplessness against rampant infection was immense frustration for medical staff, a death sentence for countless wounded soldiers. It was a truly terrible, utterly hopeless situation. In this pre-antibiotic era, amputation was often the only recourse to stop raging infections spreading and killing patients. Shattered limbs, or those heavily infected with gas gangrene, were frequently removed. Operations were under basic anesthesia, chloroform or ether, carrying their own risks. Surgery itself was brutal. Post-suppurative infection remained a constant threat. For soldiers, losing a limb was a life-altering trauma, even if it saved their life from a much worse and truly agonizing fate. If a soldier survived initial treatment and was deemed capable of further travel, he was evacuated to a casualty clearing station, CCS. These were larger, better-equipped medical facilities miles behind front lines, theoretically out of most artillery range. Here, more extensive surgical procedures could be performed by specialized teams. However, even at the CCS, wounded volume could be overwhelming. Battle against infection continued relentlessly. It was a fight for every precious life, day and night. Medical staff, doctors, nurses, orderlies, stretcher-bearers worked under unimaginable conditions, often showing extraordinary courage, dedication. They faced an unmatched tide of horrific injuries, devastating diseases, armed with limited tools. By today's standards, sights, sounds, smells of their workplaces were nightmarish. Emotional, psychological toll of witnessing so much suffering, able to do so little for so many, was immense. It was a heavy burden they carried for their whole lives after the long war finally ended. In the end, the gauntlet of wounds, rampant diseases, and often desperate, limited medical care formed a perfect storm of physical suffering for the WWI soldier. Beyond fear of violent battle, death was gnawing dread of a festering wound, consuming illness, or painful primitive surgery. This constant vulnerability to the body's own betrayal, in an environment designed to break it, was a fundamental, soul-crushing aspect of why it truly, profoundly sucked to be there, in that awful, terrible place. Beyond physical battle scars, shrapnel, bullets, festering wounds, WWI inflicted unseen yet profoundly debilitating injuries. This chapter delves into mind and spirit, exploring constant, grinding fear, a soldier's daily companion, and the devastating condition then known as shell shock. These invisible wounds were a silent epidemic. They were a testament to unbearable psychological pressures of industrialized warfare, on a scale never before seen by humankind, a new kind of suffering for a new kind of war. These mental and emotional torments were, for many, as crippling as any physical injury. The terror of the trenches, the endless exposure to death and destruction, and the sheer unrelenting stress chipped away at the strongest resolve. Yet, in an era that often prized stoicism and a stiff upper lip, these internal struggles were poorly understood, frequently dismissed, or even punished. The soldier fought not only a visible enemy, but also a desperate internal battle against the erosion of his own mind and sanity. Fear in the trenches of World War I was not merely the acute, adrenaline-fueled terror of an attack, though that was certainly present. It was a more chronic, pervasive, and grinding anxiety, a low, constant hum beneath the surface of daily life. It became an atmosphere as inescapable as the mud or the stench. This fear was a corrosive force, slowly eating away at a soldier's nerves, his ability to cope, and his fundamental sense of safety in the world, a dreadful, unending companion for his days and nights. Sources of this constant fear were legion, unpredictable artillery thuds, each a potential annihilation harbinger. Sniper's rifle crack, a personal threat from unseen enemy. Dread of trench raids in dead of night. Silent, creeping gas attack horror. Even ground beneath could betray with collapsing trenches. Sight of dead, mutilated comrades was a constant, visceral reminder of their own precarious hold on life. Death was an ever-present neighbor, its shadow falling over every single waking and sleeping moment. Under such conditions, it was virtually impossible to truly relax or feel genuinely safe. Even during relative quiet on their front sector, knowledge that danger could erupt any moment kept nerves taut. Sleep, when it came, was often shallow, disturbed, punctuated by nightmares, a shell's sudden crash, or need to startle awake for sentry duty. There was no sanctuary, no true respite from the gnawing apprehension that clung to them. It was a life lived perpetually on the very edge of disaster. Continuous exposure to extreme stress, fear, had deeply corrosive effect on soldiers' psyche. Resilience, however strong initially, wore down over weeks, months, years of relentless pressure. The human mind isn't designed for such prolonged high-alert trauma exposure. Constant death anticipation, battles, sensory overload, loss of comrades, all contributed to a gradual, or sometimes sudden, unraveling of mental-emotional stability. It was a slow bleed of the spirit, a hidden casualty of war's demands. Soldiers developed various coping mechanisms, though these were often fragile and inadequate against the overwhelming tide of fear. Fatalism, the belief that if a shell has your name on it, there's nothing you can do, was common. Gallows humor, dark and cynical, provided a temporary release. Letters to and from home offered a precious link to normality and love. But beneath these surface adaptations, the underlying dread usually remained, a cold companion in the quiet moments, a shadow in the back of the mind, always it seemed. As the war dragged on, a new and terrifying phenomenon became increasingly apparent among soldiers on all sides: shell shock. The term itself was coined in early 1915 by a British medical officer, Charles Myers. Initially, it was widely believed to be a physical injury to the brain or nervous system, caused by the concussive force of exploding artillery shells, a literal shock to the nerves. This theory suggested that the sheer vibration of battle was damaging the delicate structures of the mind itself. However, as more men not directly exposed to shell blasts showed similar symptoms, some doctors recognized shell shock wasn't solely physical. It became increasingly, though grudgingly, acknowledged the condition could also be a profound psychological response to overwhelming, sustained war trauma. Constant fear, horrific sights, relentless noise, emotional devastation of industrial-scale combat. It was a wound of the mind inflicted by experiences beyond normal human endurance for so long. The problem's scale was immense, far exceeding military or medical authority anticipation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers across warring nations were affected, to varying degrees. Hospitals, clearing stations found themselves inundated with men suffering these invisible wounds, physically intact but mentally shattered. Shell shock became one of the Great War's most enduring, tragic medical legacies. Testament to its unprecedented psychological toll, was a silent plague sweeping through the ranks of all armies. Symptoms of then-termed shell shock were diverse, often deeply disturbing to witness. Most common physical manifestations: uncontrollable tremors, shaking, sometimes so violent the soldier couldn't stand or hold objects. These shakes, often called, could affect entire body or be localized to limbs. Tics, muscle spasms, convulsive fits, similar to epileptic seizures, were also frequently observed. It was a visible sign of the internal turmoil raging within the afflicted man, a body betraying its owner. Communication was frequently impaired. Mutism, complete inability to speak despite no physical vocal cord injury, was a striking symptom. Soldiers might be silent for days, weeks, or longer. Others developed severe stammers or speech impediments not present before traumatic experiences. Some exhibited functional deafness or blindness, unable to hear or see, yet exams revealed no organic ear or eye damage. It was a baffling, sad condition, the senses shutting down in self-defense from the horror. Beyond deafness, blindness, other sensory motor disturbances were common. Some developed paralysis or severe limb weakness, impossible to walk or use arms, again without discernible physical cause. A fixed, vacant, or staring gaze, the thousand-yard stare, became a haunting hallmark of many who endured prolonged combat exposure. It was as if their eyes had seen too much horror, their minds retreated to some distant, unreachable place. It was a look of utter, profound despair and detachment from reality. Emotional, cognitive symptoms were equally devastating. Nightmares, terrifying flashbacks where soldiers relived traumatic experiences with vivid intensity were common, robbing sleep and peace. Severe anxiety, panic attacks, constant hyperarousal where sudden noise or movement triggered extreme reaction, plagued many. Confusion, disorientation, inability to concentrate, significant memory loss, particularly for traumatic events, also frequently reported. The mind struggled to process the unthinkable horrors it had seen. For some, psychological strain led to complete breakdown in their ability to function. They might descend into catatonia, unresponsive, immobile for extended periods. Others exhibited uncontrolled emotional outbursts, fits of weeping, rage, or hysteria seeming to come from nowhere. Some men wandered off in a daze, unaware of surroundings or dangers faced. These were individuals whose minds had simply been overwhelmed by the sheer, unremitting horror. Their psychological defenses had entirely collapsed. Prevailing attitudes towards shell shock in war's early years often showed profound lack of understanding, sympathy. Many in military hierarchy, even some medical professionals, viewed sufferers with suspicion. Symptoms were frequently attributed to malingering, faking illness to escape duty, or inherent weakness, a lack of moral fiber. Men already suffering deeply often met not compassion, but disbelief, disdain, or outright hostility. This only compounded their already terrible internal suffering. Consequence of these attitudes, shell shock treatment could be harsh, punitive. Soldiers with symptoms might face disciplinary measures, public shaming, or ordered to pull themselves together or return to the front. In most extreme, tragic cases, men whose actions likely resulted from severe psychological breakdown were court-martialed, even executed for cowardice or desertion. The system often failed to distinguish between a broken mind and deliberate dereliction of duty. It was a cruel injustice. Medical approaches to shell shock, when not punitive, were often rudimentary, experimental, reflecting limited understanding of psychological trauma. Some forward-thinking doctors advocated rest, quiet, good nutrition away from the front. Others employed talking cures, early psychotherapy seeds. However, more dubious treatments were common: painful electrotherapy, hydrotherapy, baths, water jets, enforced isolation. These often did more harm than good, adding to the suffering of the already broken men. Significant institutional failure to adequately prepare for or address the mental health crisis, WWI unleashed. Psychological casualty scale was unprecedented. Military medical systems ill-admit. Stigma of mental illness meant many soldiers were reluctant to admit suffering for fear of being labeled cowards or weak. This culture of silence suppression undoubtedly exacerbated the problem. It left countless men to suffer entirely alone with their terrible, unseen, and deeply misunderstood invisible wounds. This pervasive lack of understanding, with harsh or ineffective treatments, compounded shell shock sufferers' suffering. They endured terrifying symptoms, nightmares, tremors, anxiety, and faced disbelief, condemnation, inadequate care. Their invisible wounds, often dismissed, their pain invalidated. This societal, institutional failure made their heavy burden even harder to bear. It is a lonely, isolating path of deep suffering, with little hope of true relief or genuine, compassionate understanding. Constant grinding fear and shell shock's shattering impact were undeniable, though often unacknowledged, reasons why it sucked so profoundly to be a WWI soldier. These invisible wounds, born of unimaginable stress, horror, left scars as deep, lasting as any physical injury. For countless survivors, war didn't end in 1918. It raged within their minds for life. It was a silent internal battle against haunting trench ghosts. A testament to the deep psychological price paid by those who endured that awful, all-consuming war. In the bleak and brutal landscape of World War I, where grand strategies and horrific battles dominated the narrative, the daily personal struggles of the common soldier often revolved around the most fundamental of human needs: sustenance and moments of fleeting comfort. This chapter peers into that intimate world, exploring the monotonous rations that fill their bellies but rarely their spirits, the constant quest for safe water, and the tiny, precious islands of relief that helped men endure an otherwise unbearable existence, if only for a brief, precious, and all too fleeting moment. For the soldier in the trenches, even these basic elements of life were fraught with difficulty, often adding another layer to the pervasive misery. Yet paradoxically, it was in these very struggles, and in the cherished small comforts they managed to find or receive, that flickers of humanity and resilience shone through. These were not grand gestures of heroism, but the quiet, desperate acts of men trying to survive, to find a sliver of solace in a world seemingly designed to crush the human spirit entirely with its unceasing, grinding harshness and daily despair. The cornerstone of the British soldier's diet, and often a source of grim humor and endless complaint, was bully beef. This was tin corned beef, a fatty, salty, and profoundly monotonous staple. Eaten cold from the tin, fried if cooking facilities allowed, or mixed into other unappetizing concoctions, it provided calories but little cheer. Its very name became synonymous with the dreary, unchanging nature of trench rations. While filling a hole, it rarely satisfied the palate or lifted the spirits of the men who depended on it daily for their very meager sustenance. Accompanying the bully beef were the infamous hardtack biscuits. These were incredibly hard, dry, and often tasteless slabs of unleavened bread, designed for longevity rather than enjoyment. Soldiers joked they were better suited as building materials or fuel for small fires. Teeth were sometimes broken attempting to bite into them. More often, they were soaked in tea or water to make them remotely chewable. These biscuits were a testament to the challenges of supplying a massive army, but a daily trial for the men who had to consume them, often with great difficulty and discomfort. Beyond bully beef and biscuits, rations might include other tinned items. Makanachi stew, a concoction of meat, potatoes, and vegetables in a thin gravy, was a common sight, though opinions on its palatability varied wildly. Some found it a welcome change, others loathed it. Jam, typically plum and apple due to its cheapness and availability, offered a touch of sweetness. Small quantities of cheese, and occasionally bacon if delivered fresh enough to the front, rounded out the monotonous but essential daily caloric intake for soldiers facing immense physical challenges every single day. The overall impression of trench food was one of dreary sameness and often sheer unappetising-ness. Hot meals were a luxury, usually prepared some distance behind the lines and often arriving cold or lukewarm after a perilous journey through communication trenches. Food was frequently contaminated by mud, dirt, or the general filth of the surroundings. This constant dissatisfaction with their diet, the lack of fresh ingredients, and the sheer boredom of eating the same things day in, day out, added to the soldiers' general discontent and often vocal, weary complaints about their lot. Getting even these basic rations to the men at the very front was a monumental and dangerous undertaking. Supply parties had to navigate shell-pocked terrain, often at night, under the threat of enemy fire. Roads were frequently impassable, and light railways or pack mules struggled in the mud. As a result, rations could be delayed, damaged, or arrive spoiled. The men understood these difficulties, but that knowledge did little to alleviate the gnawing hunger or the frustration when expected supplies failed to materialize on time, a common and deeply felt frustration. Water, the most essential element for life, was a constant source of anxiety and difficulty in the trenches. Clean, potable water was incredibly scarce. The landscape was often a morass of shell holes filled with stagnant, muddy water, frequently contaminated by human and animal waste, decaying bodies, and chemical residues from explosives or gas attacks. Drinking directly from such sources was a direct route to debilitating diseases like dysentery or cholera, a risk that desperate, thirsty men sometimes tragically took when nothing else was available, risking severe illness for a moment's desperate relief from thirst. To combat waterborne diseases, soldiers were issued with purification tablets, usually containing chloride of lime. While effective in killing many bacteria, these tablets imparted a vile, chemical taste to the water, making it almost unpalatable. The choice was often between risking illness from untreated water or enduring the unpleasant, metallic tang of treated water. Neither was appealing. Large canvas water tanks or petrol tins were used to transport water forward, but these too could become contaminated or damaged during their journey, adding yet another layer of risk to their essential supply. The physical exertion of trench life, combined with the often salty rations, meant that thirst was a constant companion. During marches, attacks, or periods of heavy labor, the need for water became acute. Men would dream of clean, cool streams or fresh well water. The reality was often a lukewarm, chemically tainted mouthful from a shared water bottle, carefully rationed. This persistent thirst, and the struggle to safely quench it, was another layer of the daily physical misery endured by every soldier at the front lines of the long, drawn-out, and terrible war. In the midst of such deprivation and stress, small comforts assumed an immense psychological importance. Cigarettes and tobacco were perhaps the most universal solace. The act of lighting up, the brief ritual of a smoke, provided a moment of calm, a temporary distraction from the surrounding horrors. Cigarettes were traded, shared, and treasured. For many, a good supply of fags was as vital as rations. The glowing tip of a cigarette in the darkness was a small beacon of shared humanity and fleeting personal peace for all who partook in that simple ritual. A warm drink, particularly tea, held a near-sacred status for British and Commonwealth soldiers. The effort involved in brewing tea under trench conditions, scrounging fuel for a small fire, heating water in a battered mess tin, often under intermittent shell fire, made the eventual reward all the more precious. A hot, sweet mug of tea could momentarily dispel the chill, offer a sense of normalcy, and provide a comfortable ritual in a world stripped of most comforts. Coffee or cocoa, when available, offered similar cherished relief from the cold, the wet, and the ever-present misery. Mail from home was a vital lifeline, a tangible connection to a world of peace, love, and sanity. The arrival of the mail orderly was an eagerly anticipated event. Reading a letter from a mother, wife, sweetheart, or friend could lift a soldier's spirits immeasurably, offering news, reassurance, and a reminder of what he was fighting for. Conversely, a lack of mail or letters bearing bad news could plunge a man into deep despair. These flimsy pieces of paper carried an enormous emotional weight for all the men there, far from their homes. Even more prized, perhaps, were parcels from home. These carefully packed boxes might contain luxuries unimaginable in the trenches: chocolate, cake, tinned fruits, condensed milk, or home-knitted socks, scarves, and balaclavas. The arrival of a parcel was a moment of intense excitement, not just for the recipient, but often for his close comrades with whom he might share the contents. These tangible tokens of love and care from afar provided a much-needed morale boost and a fleeting taste of normalcy and simple, forgotten pleasures of a life they desperately hoped to return to someday soon. Beyond these, other minor solaces helped men endure. Reading, when books or newspapers could be obtained and conditions allowed, offered an escape. Singing, though often tinged with melancholy or gallows humor, could foster a sense of unity. The quiet companionship of trusted comrades, sharing a moment of silence or a whispered joke, was itself a profound comfort. These small, human moments, snatched from the jaws of an impersonal and brutal war, were essential for maintaining a sliver of sanity and hope for the future, however dim that future might appear. The daily struggle for basic sustenance in World War I was often a grim affair, with monotonous food and scarce, tainted water adding to the soldiers' burdens. Yet, it was precisely because of this pervasive hardship that the small comforts, a cigarette, a letter, a shared cup of tea, became disproportionately precious. These fleeting moments of relief were tiny islands of humanity in a vast ocean of misery, offering a brief respite and a reminder of a life beyond the trenches, underscoring yet another reason why this war truly sucked, a daily battle for both body and the weary soul. As our journey through the harrowing landscape of a World War I soldier's existence draws to a gentle close, we pause to reflect on the myriad reasons why, for those who endured it, this conflict was an unparalleled tapestry of suffering. We have walked in our thoughts through the mud-filled trenches, listened to the symphony of hell, and felt the chill of constant grinding fear. The picture that emerges is one not of glory, but of a profound and enduring misery, a daily battle for survival against overwhelming odds, a somber testament to the very limits of human endurance in the brutal face of unimaginable daily hardship and loss. We recall the environment itself, a relentless adversary, the thick, cloying mud that swallowed men and hope alike, the source of agonizing trenchfoot, the chilling damp that seeped into bones, offering no respite, the oppressive confinement of the narrow, unstable trenches, and the pervasive, inescapable stench. A sickening blend of decay, filth, and chemicals. This was the very air they breathed, the ground they walked, a constant sensory assault that wore down the body and the spirit, day after weary day, a truly awful and almost physically oppressive physical world that never relented in its harshness. We remember the daily struggle for basic human needs, the monotonous, often unappetizing rations, bully beef, and hard biscuits offering sustenance but little comfort, the desperate search for clean water, often a choice between dehydration and disease, and the unwelcome companions, the bold, disease-carrying rats feasting on corpses and rations, the countless itching lice that tormented every soldier, spreading trench fever. These intimate, biological battles were fought daily, adding a layer of personal degradation to the larger conflict around them, a struggle just to maintain basic bodily function and some small dignity. And then there were the more direct horrors of combat, magnified by industrial technology, the ceaseless, deafening roar of artillery, shaking the earth and the mind, the silent, creeping terror of poison gas, bringing agonizing death or lifelong injury. The dreaded order to go over the top, a near-certain charge into a hail of machine gun fire across the desolate, corpse-strewn expanse of no man's land. The ghastly wounds inflicted by shrapnel, bullets, and bayonets, often leading to slow, painful deaths in the pre-antibiotic era of that time, making survival an even more tenuous proposition for all. Beyond the visible scars, we have touched upon the invisible wounds, the constant, grinding fear that gnawed at every soldier, the inability to ever truly relax or feel safe from sudden death or mutilation, the terrifying phenomenon of shell shock, the mind's rebellion against unbearable trauma, manifesting in tremors, muteness, nightmares, and complete psychological breakdown. These were injuries of the soul, poorly understood and often cruelly dismissed, yet as debilitating as any physical blow, a silent, internal screaming against the horrors that simply would not cease their relentless assault. Life in the trenches, therefore, was not simply a battle against a human enemy across a defined front line. It was a constant multi-front war waged simultaneously against a hostile environment that sought to suck them under, against rampant diseases that attacked from within, against the ever-present fear that eroded their sanity, and yes, against the bullets and shells of the opposing army. Every waking moment, and many a sleeping one, was a struggle for survival on numerous, exhausting, and often terrifying fronts of this awful conflict, a daily siege against their bodies, their minds, and their very souls. Yet, amidst this catalog of almost unimaginable horrors millions of men endured, they found ways to cope, to maintain a semblance of humanity, to support their comrades. This quiet daily heroism of survival, this simple act of carrying on in the face of such overwhelming adversity, speaks volumes about the resilience of the human spirit. It was an endurance born not of glory or patriotic fervor alone, but often of a grim determination, a sense of duty to those beside them, and perhaps a clinging to the faintest glimmer of hope for a future beyond the wire. a future that many would tragically never get to see or experience. When we seek to understand World One's true grim nature, it's not enough to study generals' grand strategies or map lines. We must look to the ordinary soldier's lived experience, this daily tapestry of suffering, boredom, fear, and fleeting comforts. Their ordeal, repeated millions of times over in trenches of the Western Front and beyond, defines this conflict's character. It was a war consuming a generation, leaving a legacy of loss and a profound, somber understanding of industrial warfare's true human cost, a lesson written in their blood and their copious tears, a sorrowful record of a generation's profound and terrible sacrifice. So as these somber reflections settle, perhaps they guide us to quiet understanding, gentle empathy for those who lived through such a wretched time. The enduring misery of the great war soldier was not history's footnote, but its central human text. Their sacrifice, suffering, their simple, incredible endurance in that hellish landscape reminds us of conflict's true cost. May their experiences, however grim, foster in us a deeper appreciation for peace, and allow us now, with this understanding, to gently drift away into quiet, peaceful rest as darkness falls, carrying with us the solemn weight of their story and the peace they were so long denied.